The hiss of the steam engine was a dying breath. For 3 days, it had been the rhythm of Clara Mayfield's world, a chuffing, clanking heartbeat pulling her west, away from the manicured green lawns and predictable rains of Massachusetts. Now, that heartbeat was slowing, each exhalation of steam a final sigh as the train scraped and groaned its way alongside a rough-hewn wooden platform. Outside the grime-streaked window, there was no green. There was only red and brown and a sky so vast and pale it seemed to have bleached all the color from the earth beneath it. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, the worn velvet of the seat a small, familiar comfort against her back. She felt the vibration cease, the final lurch that signaled arrival. New Canaan, New Mexico. The name, spoken aloud in the Boston station, had sounded of promise, of a biblical fresh start, written in Charles Benton's neat, deliberate hand. It had felt like a sanctuary, stared at now, through the dusty glass. It looked like the edge of the world. She gathered her reticule, her gloved fingers tightening on the clasp. Inside, beside a few carefully folded dollars, was Charles's last letter. Its creases were soft as old linen from her constant rereading. "You will find it a simple place. Miss Mayfield," he had written, "but one of good, hard-working folk. I trust you will bring a measure of Eastern grace that we sorely lack. I await your arrival with anticipation." Anticipation. The word felt hollow now, a pebble rattling in the vast emptiness outside. She stood, smoothing the front of her traveling dress. It was a practical choice, a sturdy serge of a deep blue that wouldn't show the dust. But even after days of travel, she had kept the lace at her collar and cuffs impeccably clean. It was a small armor, a final remnant of the woman she had been. The conductor, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and wind, pulled open the heavy door. The heat struck first. It wasn't the humid, clinging heat of a Boston summer. This was a dry, searing force, like opening an oven. It carried with it the smell of dust, not the damp earth smell of home, but a fine, powdery grit that tasted of minerals and distance. Clara held her breath and stepped down. Her boots sank slightly into the red dust that covered the platform planks. And then she felt it. Not the sun, not the wind that immediately began to tug at the stray strands of hair pinned neatly in her chignon, but the weight of eyes. The town had stopped. It wasn't a large town, scarcely more than one wide, rutted street lined with squat, false-fronted buildings that seemed to be bracing themselves against the endless expanse. But it seemed everyone with breath in their lungs had found a reason to be at the station at that moment. The station master, a thin man in a sweat-stained vest, ceased his work to watch her. A trio of men who had been leaning against the wall of the telegraph office slowly straightened up, their expressions unreadable, but their focus absolute. Across the way, 2 women in sun-faded calico dresses, baskets on their arms, stopped mid-sentence. One nudged the other, her hand rising to shield a whisper that was as loud as a shout in the sudden stillness. Clara kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on the station building ahead. She could feel their inventory, one woman, alone, one trunk, modest in size, being unloaded with a thud by a baggage handler. No family to greet her, no smiling fiancé rushing forward. Her dress was well made but plain, her bonnet practical. Her face, she knew, was pale with exhaustion, the shadows beneath her eyes telling a story of sleepless nights spent swaying with the rhythm of the rails, but she would not let them see the fatigue in her posture. Her back remained as straight as the steel tracks that had brought her here. Pride was a currency she still possessed, and she would not spend it freely. The whispers began to ripple, a low hum beneath the sighing of the wind. "From back east, I reckon. Look at her hands. Bet she's never scrubbed a floor. Alone. Ain't she a woman alone?" That observation was left hanging in the air, heavy with implication. "Benton's mail-order bride, they say." This was followed by a low chuckle, a sound that pricked at Clara's composure more than any direct insult. They knew. Of course, they knew. In a town this small, a secret was a commodity more valuable and more quickly spent than gold. She walked toward her trunk, her steps measured. Each footfall on the dusty planks felt deliberate, an act of defiance. She was not a curiosity to be gawked at. She was Clara Mayfield, daughter of a professor, a woman of letters and education, who had made a difficult choice for a secure future. She was the future wife of Charles Benton, Esquire. She repeated this to herself, a silent mantra against the rising tide of their judgment. The train gave a great hiss of steam, its bell beginning to clang a slow, mournful farewell. It was leaving. Her last tie to everything familiar was preparing to slide away into the shimmering heat haze. A knot of panic tightened in her chest, cold and sharp. For a fleeting, desperate moment, she wanted to turn, to run back to the car, to plead with the conductor to take her back to the world of brick sidewalks and predictable seasons. But she didn't. She stood her ground, her hand resting on the leather strap of her trunk, and watched it go. The chuffing grew more rapid, the great wheels churning, kicking up a cloud of red dust. The faces in the windows were blurs. Then it was just the last car, shrinking, becoming a speck on the horizon until it was finally swallowed by the immense, indifferent landscape. The silence it left behind was profound. Now, there was only the wind and the whispers. "Well, she's here," one of the men drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that landed alarmingly close to the hem of her skirt. "Now to see if Benton still wants her." Another man laughed. "He's particular. Is Charles. Wants a wife, not an opinion." Clara's knuckles were white where she gripped her reticule. She would not look at them. She would not give them the satisfaction of her anger or her fear. She focused on the details of the town before her, trying to map this new reality. The saloon, named simply the Watering Hole, had swinging doors that gaped open like a mouth. The general store promised provisions and dry goods. A blacksmith's hammer rang out with a steady, metallic rhythm, a lonely, industrious sound in the quiet. Everything, from the horse trough to the lettering on the signs, was covered in the same fine layer of red dust. It was as if the land itself was slowly, patiently reclaiming everything man had built upon it. She carried a promise in her heart, a promise of a home, of companionship, of a life rebuilt from the ashes of her family's misfortune. Charles's letters had been proper, intelligent, and kind. He had spoken of shared intellectual pursuits, of building a respectable home, of the quiet dignity of life in a place where a man's word was his bond. He had painted a picture of a life that was stable, secure, and far from the pitying glances of her relations back in Boston, who saw her as little more than an unmarried burden. But Charles had not written about the searing sun or the invasive dust. He had not mentioned the weight of a town's collective stare, a force so palpable it felt like a physical touch. He had not prepared her for the raw, untamed nature of this place, where propriety seemed to have been baked out of the very air. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the gritty air filling her lungs. The town would talk. She had known it would. In her most honest, sleepless moments on the train, she had pictured this scrutiny, but the reality was harsher, more personal. It was an appraisal not just of her station, but of her worth, her resilience, her very right to be there. They were weighing her, and she could feel them finding her wanting. A child, no older than 5, darted out from beside his mother and pointed a grubby finger. "Mama, why's that lady all alone?" The mother snatched him back, her face flushing as she shot Clara an apologetic, yet still judging, glance. "Hush now. Thomas, it ain't polite to point." Clara's gaze met the woman's for a brief second. In that fleeting contact, she saw it all, the curiosity, the pity, the faint, undeniable spark of superiority. "You are not one of us." "Fine," she thought, her resolve hardening like clay in a kiln. "I am not, but I am here." With her back straight and her eyes fixed on the office that bore the sign, C. Benton, Attorney at Law, halfway down the street, Clara Mayfield took her first step off the train platform. She left the relative safety of the station and set foot in the deep red dust of New Canaan's main thoroughfare, ready to claim the future she had been promised, no matter how many whispers followed in her wake. The dust of the street was a living thing. It rose in lazy puffs with each step she took, coating the hem of her blue serge dress and the toes of her sturdy boots in a fine red powder. The sign for C. Benton, Attorney at Law, was painted in neat black letters on a piece of wood that hung from a wrought iron bracket. The paint was already beginning to flake under the relentless assault of the sun. For a moment, Clara paused, her hand hovering over her reticule, a sudden wave of apprehension washing over her. This was the moment, the culmination of 1,000 miles of hope and uncertainty. She could still feel the eyes of the town on her back. The whispers had quieted, but the watching had not. It was a heavy, physical presence, a collective judgment that followed her like a shadow. She imagined their thoughts, their smug predictions. She's not what he's expecting. He'll send her packing on the next train out. The thought sent a chill through her. Despite the oppressive heat, she pushed it down. Charles was a man of reason, of letters. He would see past the dust of her journey to the person he had come to know through their correspondence. He would be her sanctuary from this harsh, judgmental place. Taking a steadying breath, she pushed open the door. It was like stepping into another world. The air inside was still and blessedly cool, heavy with the scent of old paper, leather, and lemon polish. The relentless glare of the sun was tamed by thick green curtains drawn across the single large window. A floor-to-ceiling bookshelf dominated one wall, filled with thick, sober-looking volumes bound in dark leather. Order reigned here. Every book was flush with its neighbor. Every stack of paper on the massive oak desk was squared away with geometric precision. This was the room of a man who fought against the chaos of the world outside, and won. The man sitting behind the desk looked up as the small bell above the door tinkled. He was exactly as she had imagined from his careful, formal prose. He was perhaps 40 years of age, with thinning brown hair combed neatly across his scalp and a face that was more scholarly than weathered. He wore a starched white shirt and a dark waistcoat. Despite the heat, his spectacles were perched on his nose, and he looked at her over them, his expression one of polite inquiry. "May I help you?" he asked. His voice was calm and measured, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. Clara closed the door behind her, shutting out the street and its prying eyes. "Mr. Benton," she said, her own voice sounding surprisingly steady. "It is I, Clara Mayfield." Charles Benton blinked. He slowly removed his spectacles, his fingers polishing the lenses with a small piece of chamois leather from his desk. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and it bought him time. Time to look at her. And look he did. His gaze was not lascivious like the men on the street, but it was just as thorough, just as invasive. It was an appraisal. He took in the sturdy, travel-worn dress, the faint sheen of perspiration on her brow that she hadn't had a chance to powder away, the set of her jaw that was more firm than demure. He saw the intelligence in her clear, direct gaze, and the utter lack of feminine helplessness in her posture. She stood before him not as a supplicant, but as an equal who had arrived to keep an appointment. A flicker of something disappointment alarm passed through his eyes before being swiftly hidden behind a mask of professional courtesy. He stood, though he was not a tall man, and gestured to the straight-backed chair opposite his desk. "Miss Mayfield," he said, and the name sounded different on his lips than it had in her own mind. Colder. "Of course, please be seated. Your journey, was it arduous?" "It was long," Clara replied, sitting down and placing her reticule in her lap. She did not slump into the chair, exhausted as she was, but manageable. The railroad is a marvel of modern engineering. Her answer was direct, factual. She saw another flicker in his eyes. He had likely expected a litany of complaints, a more feminine recitation of discomforts. She had offered an observation on engineering instead. An uncomfortable silence descended. The only sound was the slow, ponderous ticking of a large clock on the wall. Charles sat back down, placing his polished spectacles carefully back on his nose. He steepled his fingers, a gesture that seemed designed to project thoughtful authority, but which only betrayed his unemployment. "I must confess," he began, his gaze directed at a point just over her left shoulder. "You are not quite as I had pictured." Clara felt her spine stiffen. "And you, Mr. Benton, are precisely as your letters described you, a man of order and principle." She had meant it as a compliment, a bridge across this strange, sudden gulf between them. But he did not seem to hear it that way. "My letters," he said, seizing on the word. "Yes, perhaps they were inadequate. It is difficult, you see, to convey the realities of a place like New Canaan in mere ink." He cleared his throat. "Life here is stark, Miss Mayfield. It requires a certain temperament." "I am aware of its challenges," she said quietly. "I did not come here expecting the comforts of Boston." No, of course not," he said quickly, a little too quickly. He finally met her gaze, and what she saw there made the cold knot in her stomach tighten into a stone. It was not unkindness. It was a profound and unshakable discomfort. He was looking at her as if she were a problem to be solved. It is not a matter of comfort, but of suitability. The role of a wife here, a lawyer's wife in particular, is one of quiet support, of managing a household with grace, of smoothing over the rough edges of society. It requires a gentle disposition. The unspoken words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating as the dust outside. "And you are not gentle. You are strong. Your edges are not smooth. They are sharp." Clara's hands, hidden in her lap, clenched into fists. She could feel the blood draining from her face. This was not happening. This could not be the man who had written of shared readings and intellectual companionship. This was a stranger, a man who had advertised for a household ornament and was now displeased with the article that had been delivered. "I believe my education and upbringing have prepared me to be a capable partner and a competent household manager, Mr. Benton," she said, her voice low and tight with the effort of keeping it from trembling. "Your education is, I am sure, most admirable," he conceded, looking away again. "But it is that very thing, perhaps your acuity. A woman of your intellect and your directness would find herself ill-suited to the social expectations here. You would be unhappy, and your unhappiness would reflect upon my standing in this community." There it was, the heart of the matter. Not her happiness, but his standing. The whispers of the town had already reached him, had already poisoned the well before she ever had a chance to draw from it. He had looked out his window, seen the woman who stood alone on the platform, meeting the stares of the town with a straight back and a high chin, and he had been afraid. He did not want a partner. He wanted a shield, and she was not the right shape. The silence that followed was absolute. The clock on the wall seemed to be ticking off the final seconds of the life she had imagined. Each tick was a hammer blow against her heart. It was a physical pain, a sharp, brutal ache that radiated from her chest through her entire body. She had gambled everything on this man, on his written words, and she had lost. She did not cry. She would not give him tears. She would not give the town outside the satisfaction. Pride, she had told herself, was a currency she still possessed, and now it was all she had left. She rose slowly from the chair, her movements fluid and deliberate. She was no longer the tired traveler, but a woman carved from granite. "I see," she said, and her voice was a shard of ice. It seems we have both been the victims of a profound misunderstanding. You were expecting a docile ornament to adorn your home, and I—" She paused, letting her cool, level gaze sweep over his meticulously ordered desk. "Was expecting a man." Charles Benton flinched as if she had struck him. A dull red flush crept up his neck. He stood up, knocking a stack of papers slightly askew. He reached out to straighten them, his hands betraying a sudden tremor. "Now see here, Miss Mayfield, there is no need for incivility. I am merely thinking of what is best for all parties involved." "Do not presume to know what is best for me, sir," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You have made your assessment based on a 5-minute interview and the gossip of ignorant minds. You have found me unsuitable. I, in turn, find you lacking in courage." He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. He simply stared, his face a mask of shock and indignation. He was a man used to controlling the narrative, to winning arguments with logic and precedent. He had no defense against the simple, unassailable truth of her accusation. Without another word, Clara turned her back on him. She walked to the door, each step an echo in the silent, stuffy office. Her hand was steady as she turned the knob. As she pulled the door open, the heat and the light of the street flooded in, and with it, the sounds of the town that had already condemned her. She did not look back. She stepped out of the cool, ordered tomb of Charles Benton's office and back into the searing, honest glare of the West. Her heart was a shattered thing in her chest, but her head was held high. She was alone, humiliated, and 1,000 miles from anything she knew. But she would not be broken. She would not let them see her fall. The walk away from Charles Benton's office was the longest of Clara's life. The sun, now beginning its slow descent, had lost its midday ferocity, but the light it cast was a cruel, golden hue that seemed to illuminate her failure for all to see. Every window she passed felt like an eye. Every shadow seemed to hold a whispering critic. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, which before had sounded industrious, now seemed to beat out a mocking tattoo: rejected, rejected. She forced herself to walk, not run. Each step was a battle between the screaming urge to flee and the iron will that had been forged in the crucible of a proper Boston upbringing. A Mayfield did not make a scene. A Mayfield did not show distress. So she walked with her spine straight and her gaze fixed on some indeterminate point in the far distance. A queen in a tattered kingdom of one, making a royal procession through her own ruin. The faces she passed were a gallery of rustic satisfaction. The women in their calico dresses now looked at her with a mixture of pity and smug triumph. Their earlier whispers had been validated. The Eastern woman, with her educated airs and her solitary arrival, had been found wanting. The men who lounged on the boardwalk outside the saloon fell silent as she approached, their lazy conversation ceasing. They tipped their hats, but it was not a gesture of respect. It was a gesture of dismissal, a final, perfunctory courtesy to the woman who was already becoming yesterday's gossip. She reached the station, the site of her hopeful arrival what felt like a lifetime ago. Her trunk sat forlornly on the platform where the baggage handler had left it. It was a solid, well-made thing, a relic from her father's travels, but it looked small and vulnerable against the vast, empty backdrop of the plains. It was all she had in the world: a few changes of clothes, some books, and a collection of letters that were now nothing more than monuments to a lie. The station master eyed her from his office. "Train back east ain't till Tuesday morning, ma'am," he offered, his voice not unkind, but heavy with the finality of her situation. "Thank you," she managed to say, the words feeling like sandpaper in her throat. She knew she couldn't stay on the platform. It was too exposed, too public. She had to move, but where the setting sun was painting the clouds in violent strokes of orange, pink, and deep purple, the beauty of it was a bitter irony. The world was putting on a magnificent display, while hers was collapsing into darkness. The thought of spending the night out here, alone, with only her trunk for shelter, sent a tremor of pure, primal fear through her. With a surge of effort, she grabbed one of the leather handles of her trunk and pulled. It was heavy, laden with the weight of a life she could no longer lead. It scraped and bumped along the dusty planks of the platform, and then onto the dirt of the road leading out of town. She didn't have a destination. She was simply moving away from the prying eyes, away from the scene of her humiliation. She headed north, the direction from which no road seemed to lead. The last of the town's buildings fell away behind her, and the world opened up into a breathtaking, terrifying emptiness. The road dissolved into a pair of faint tracks winding through sagebrush and sparse, hardy grasses. The wind picked up, a lonely sound that swept across the land, carrying the scent of dust and wild things. Long, distorted shadows stretched from every rock and bush, turning the landscape into a strange and menacing place. She stopped, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her gloved hands raw from gripping the handle. She stood beside her trunk, a solitary, stationary figure in an immense, moving world. The humiliation that had sustained her, that had hardened her pride into a shield, was beginning to crack. Beneath it, a cold, desolate despair began to seep in. She was stranded, utterly and completely stranded. The few dollars in her reticule were a pittance, not nearly enough for a hotel room for 2 nights and a costly ticket back to a home that was no longer hers. She was so consumed by the rising tide of her own panic that she didn't hear the hoofbeats at first. They were slow, steady, and muffled by the dust. When she finally registered the sound, she spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A man on a horse was approaching, leading another behind him. He was still some distance away, a dark silhouette against the blazing sunset. Her immediate instinct was fear. The stories of the West were filled with tales of outlaws and desperate men who preyed on the vulnerable, and she had never been more vulnerable. She straightened up, her hand instinctively going to the small, sharp hat pin that held her bonnet in place. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. He drew closer, his pace unhurried. He was not a man in a rush. As he came into the clearer light, she could see the details. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, and seemed to be a part of his horse, moving with an easy, fluid grace. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, pulled low, its felt stained with sweat and time. A long, light-colored duster, frayed at the cuffs and hem, billowed slightly in the wind. It was the color of the dust itself, a garment that had seen thousands of miles of open country. He stopped his horse a respectful 10 yards from her, his gaze taking in the entire scene, the woman in the impractical Eastern dress, the heavy trunk sitting in the dirt, the rapidly fading light. He didn't smile, didn't sneer, didn't even seem particularly curious. His expression was one of quiet observation. His face was lean and weathered, browned by the sun and lined by the wind. It was a face that kept its own counsel. She could see the dust caked on his boots, not a light powdering like hers, but a deep, ingrained part of the leather itself. He looked, she thought, as if he had been carved from the very land she stood upon. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence was broken only by the sigh of the wind and the soft snort of his horse. Clara's fear began to recede, replaced by a wary defensiveness. She lifted her chin, ready to meet any comment with a sharp retort. Then he spoke, and his voice was not what she expected. It was a low, quiet rumble, with a rough edge to it, like stones moving at the bottom of a river. "You aimin' to go somewhere, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes glancing from her to the empty tracks ahead. "Sun's about down." It was not a question of judgment, nor one of pity. It was a simple, practical statement of fact. A man of this land stating the obvious night was coming, and she was in the middle of nowhere. "My destination is my own concern, sir," she replied, her voice stiffer than she intended. The man's gaze shifted back to her. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, and they looked at her with a disconcerting directness. There was no mockery in them. He simply nodded, as if accepting her right to her privacy. Ain't no concern of mine, he agreed, his voice still low and even. 'Cept there's nothing that way but 100 miles of scrub and coyote, and the night gets cold. He paused, letting the truth of his words settle in the cooling air. Can get a man killed, let alone a woman alone with a trunk. Clara's resolve wavered. He wasn't threatening her. He was warning her. He was speaking of the land as one would speak of a dangerous animal, with respect and a clear understanding of its power. The truth was, she was terrified. The thought of the cold, the darkness, the sounds of unseen creatures was a nightmare made real. She said nothing, but he must have seen the crack in her proud facade. He shifted slightly in his saddle. "Look," he said, the word coming out clipped and practical. "Town ain't much, but it's better'n this. Old Alma runs a boarding house at the south end. Clean beds, decent grub. Takes in all sorts." He paused again, and his next words were chosen with a surprising delicacy. "She won't ask questions if you've got the coin for a room." He was offering her a way out, a way to salvage a piece of her dignity. It wasn't charity, it was a business transaction. He was giving her information, a map out of her immediate predicament. He had likely seen her walk through town, had heard the gossip, had put the pieces together, but his offer was free of the condescension she had seen in every other face. Her pride warred with her pragmatism. To accept help now, from this dusty stranger, felt like another failure, but to refuse was to embrace a terrifying and possibly fatal night in the wilderness. The last rays of the sun were slipping below the horizon, and the world was being painted in shades of gray and purple. The cold was already beginning to bite. I would be grateful for the direction," she finally said, the admission costing her dearly. The man gave another short nod. He swung down from his horse in one smooth, powerful motion. He was even taller on the ground, a solid, imposing figure. He walked over to her trunk without a word, bent down, and lifted it as if it were filled with straw, with an economy of effort. He hefted it onto the saddle of the horse he'd been leading. "Her place is back past the station," he said, turning back to her. "I'm Jonah Carter. I work the Circle C north of here, just coming in for supplies." "Clara Mayfield," she replied automatically. He didn't offer to shake her hand, for which she was grateful. Instead, he took the reins of both horses. "It's a short walk." He didn't invite her to ride. He seemed to understand instinctively that she would not accept such an offer. Instead, he began to walk, leading the horses, setting a slow pace that she could easily match. They walked back toward the town that had cast her out. A strange, silent pair. The cowboy, covered in the dust of the trail, and the lady, covered in the dust of her failed ambitions. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was a quiet, shared space. He seemed to be a man who did not waste words, and Clara was too lost in the wreckage of her thoughts to try and make conversation. As they walked past the saloon, the light and noise spilling from its doors, she saw a few men turn to stare, but this time, their stares were different. They weren't just looking at the rejected mail-order bride anymore. They were looking at the man walking beside her, and his quiet, capable presence seemed to act as a shield, deflecting their judgment. They reached the south end of town, where a sturdy two-story house stood slightly apart from the other buildings. A warm, yellow light glowed from a downstairs window, and a neatly painted sign read, "Alma's Boarding House, Rooms and Meals." It looked solid, safe. Jonah Carter led the horses to the porch and swung her trunk down, setting it by the door with a soft thud. He didn't linger. He gathered his reins, his work apparently done. "Alma'll see you right," he said. It was both a statement and a reassurance. He tipped his hat, a gesture that, unlike the others she had received that day, felt like a genuine mark of respect. And then he turned, mounted his horse, and with a soft click of his tongue, rode off into the deepening twilight, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. Clara stood alone on the porch, the scent of horse and leather and dust lingering in the air. She looked at the closed door of the boarding house, another unknown waiting behind it. Her future was a complete and terrifying blank. But for the first time since the train had pulled into New Canaan, she didn't feel entirely alone. A stranger had offered her a moment of simple, practical decency, a small, sturdy anchor in the storm of her despair. She took a deep breath, raised her hand, and knocked on the door. The knock was softer than Clara had intended, a feeble tap against the solid wood, but it was answered almost immediately. The door swung inward, revealing a woman who seemed as sturdy and rooted as the house itself. She was broad of shoulder and hip, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe, practical bun. Her face was a landscape of deep lines, but her eyes, a sharp and intelligent blue, were startlingly clear. They took in Clara, the expensive but dusty dress, the pristine lace at her collar, the exhaustion in her posture, and the proud trunk on the porch, all in a single, sweeping glance. "Well," the woman said, her voice a low, no-nonsense contralto, "you must be the mail-order bride. Heard you had a short interview with Mr. Benton. Get in before the night air gives you a chill." There was no pity in her tone, only a statement of fact. Clara, momentarily stunned by the woman's directness, found herself stepping across the threshold into a large, warm common room. The air smelled of beef stew, strong coffee, and lye soap. It was a clean, lived-in smell, the scent of honest labor. A long trestle table stood in the center of the room, and a fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting a welcoming glow on the simple, sturdy furniture. "I am Alma," the woman stated, closing the door firmly behind Clara, shutting out the night. "And you're in need of a room. Jonah Carter rode by a minute ago, said you might be stopping in." She looked Clara up and down again. "He's a good judge of character, that one, usually." Clara felt a flush of her remaining pride. "I am prepared to pay for my lodging." Alma gave a short, dry chuckle. "Wouldn't have you otherwise. This ain't a charity. $2 a week for the room, 50 cents a day for meals, paid in advance." The numbers were stark, a sudden, cold accounting of her rapidly dwindling resources. But she nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She reached into her reticule and counted out the coins, the small pile of her future, and placed them in Alma's waiting hand. The hand that took them was calloused and strong, the hand of a woman who had built her life with work, not words. "Room's this way," Alma said, turning without ceremony. "Second on the left, upstairs. It ain't the Boston Ritz, but the bed's clean and the roof don't leak." Clara followed her up a creaking staircase. The room was exactly as Alma had described it. It was small, containing only a narrow, iron-frame bed with a colorful patchwork quilt, a small washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single wooden chair. A small window looked out onto the dark expanse behind the house. It was monastic in its simplicity, a stark contrast to the flocked wallpaper and heavy mahogany furniture of her former life. But it was also a sanctuary. It was 4 walls and a door that could be closed. It was safety. Alma stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her ample chest. "Heard you told Benton he lacked courage." Clara turned from the window, surprised. "News travels quickly. Faster than a horse in this town." Alma confirmed. "The only thing folks have more of than dust is opinions. So, what's your plan going back east on the Tuesday train?" The question hung in the air, a simple, practical inquiry that laid Clara's desperate situation bare. She looked at the coins remaining in her reticule. "There weren't enough, not even close. My funds are not what they ought to be," Clara admitted, the words tasting like ash. Alma nodded slowly, her sharp eyes missing nothing of the quiet desperation in Clara's face. She was silent for a long moment, and Clara braced herself for the pity, for the inevitable "I told you so" that she had seen in the eyes of the other women in town. Instead, Alma said. Honey, in New Canaan, everyone talks. It's the town's only real pastime. They'll talk about you for a day or two. They'll call you the jilted bride, the foolish Easterner. They'll say you got what you deserved for being too proud. And then the next dust storm will blow in, or someone's cow will go missing, and they'll move on to talking about that. She took a step into the room, her presence seeming to fill the small space. Talk never filled a belly nor mended a roof. It's just air. You can let it blow you over, or you can stand your ground and let it blow on by. The choice is yours. With that, she turned to leave. Supper's on in half an hour. You look like you could use a hot meal. She paused at the door. And for what it's worth, Benton is a man who irons his dollar bills. You're better off. The door clicked shut, leaving Clara alone in the quiet room. She sank onto the edge of the narrow bed, the springs groaning in protest. Alma's words echoed in her mind. Talk is just air. It was the harshest, most practical, and most profoundly comforting advice she had ever received. She had not been offered a shoulder to cry on, but something far more valuable, a foundation on which to stand. The first few days were a blur of disorientation. Clara kept to her room mostly, emerging only for the simple, hearty meals Alma served at the trestle table. The other boarders were a rotating cast of transient men, sun-scorched cowboys with quiet, watchful eyes, a pair of grizzled prospectors whose conversation was a low murmur of creeks and claims, a surveyor for the railroad, his hands stained with ink. They ate quickly and efficiently, their manners rough but not unkind. They would nod to her, a brief ma'am, but otherwise left her to her solitude. They were men defined by their work, and she was a woman without any. Her money was a constant, nagging worry. Each meal she ate was a tangible depletion of her resources. The Tuesday train came and went, its distant whistle a mournful reminder of a path she could no longer take. She was trapped. One evening, she found Alma frowning over a large, messy ledger at the kitchen table, a sputtering oil lamp casting dancing shadows on the wall. The old woman's brow was furrowed in frustration as she tried to make sense of a chaotic jumble of names, dates, and figures. Damn this scribbling. Alma muttered to herself. Can't tell if Miller owes me for 2 weeks or 3. Clara, who had been taught bookkeeping and accounting by her meticulous father, saw an opening, a flicker of purpose in the aimless sea of her days. Perhaps I could be of assistance, she offered quietly from the doorway. Alma looked up, her expression skeptical. I figured your hands were made for needlepoint and playing the pianoforte. My father was a professor, Clara said, stepping forward. He believed a woman's mind was as capable of logic as a man's. He taught me how to keep accounts. Alma considered her for a moment, then pushed the heavy ledger across the table with a sigh of defeat. Have at it. Can't make it any worse. For the next 3 nights, Clara worked by the light of that lamp. She brought order to the chaos. With a fine-tipped pen and a bottle of ink from her trunk, she created neat columns, cross-referenced payments, and balanced accounts with a precision that had been drilled into her since childhood. She found that Miller owed for 3 weeks, that a cowboy named Silas had overpaid by $1, and that Alma's supplier had been overcharging her for flour for the past 2 months. She presented her findings to Alma in a new, clean ledger, her handwriting a model of clarity. Alma studied the pages, her lips moving silently as she read. She looked at the final, balanced figure at the bottom of the page, then up at Clara. A slow look of profound, grudging respect dawned on her face. Well, I'll be, she said, her voice softer than Clara had ever heard it. You've got a head for figures. Girl, a real head for 'em. She tapped the ledger. This is good work. I'll knock a week's board off your bill. It was the first money Clara had earned in her life. The feeling of relief was so profound it almost brought her to her knees. It was more than just a week's board. It was a foothold. Her next opportunity came a few days later. A young cowboy, One of Jonah Carter's hands from the Circle C came into the common room holding a filthy, torn shirt. A long, L-shaped rip ran from the shoulder down the back, the result of a run-in with a thorny mesquite bush. "Dang it all," he grumbled, ready to toss the garment into the fire. "That's the third one this month." "Wait," Clara said, surprising herself with her own forwardness. She took the shirt from him. The fabric was sturdy, but the tear was grievous. "This can be mended." The cowboy, a raw-boned youth named Billy, laughed. "Mended, ma'am, that needs a miracle." "It needs a needle and a steady hand," she corrected. From her trunk, she retrieved a small sewing kit, a gift from her aunt filled with fine needles, silk threads, and a silver thimble. It had been intended for delicate embroidery, but it would have to do. She sat by the fire, the rough, sweat-stained fabric in her lap, and began to work. Her stitches were small, neat, and impossibly strong, a herringbone pattern that drew the torn edges together seamlessly. The other men in the room watched, their initial amusement turning to quiet fascination. They were used to their own clumsy repairs, using thick thread and awkward knots. What Clara was doing was a form of artistry, a quiet, meticulous magic. An hour later, she was done. The seam was a barely visible line, stronger than the original fabric around it. She handed it back to Billy, his jaw hung open in disbelief. "Ma'am, how much do I owe you?" he stammered. 10 cents, she said. He eagerly pressed the coin into her hand and left, holding the shirt as if it were a holy relic. The next day, 2 more cowboys from his outfit appeared at Alma's door, hats in hand, holding torn shirts and trousers in need of repair. The day after that, there were 4. Her reputation began to change. The whispers in town didn't stop, but they acquired a new flavor. She was no longer just Benton's folly. She was now the woman at Alma's, the one who could fix anything from a ledger to a pair of denim breeches. Her story became less a tale of rejection and more a curiosity of resilience. They say she was a fine lady, but she ain't too proud to take a needle to a cowboy's laundry. It was a backhanded compliment, but in New Canaan, it was a compliment nonetheless. Clara set up a small table in a corner of the common room. By day, she mended. By night, she balanced Alma's books and wrote letters for the illiterate cowboys, translating their clumsy, heartfelt sentiments to faraway mothers and sweethearts into prose that was both elegant and true to their simple words. Her life fell into a new rhythm, one dictated by the rising sun, the demands of her work, and the clatter of plates at supper time. It was a hard, simple life. Her hands, once soft and pale, became chapped and pricked by the needle. Her fine dresses stayed packed in her trunk, replaced by a simple, practical skirt and blouse bought from the general store with her own earnings. One evening, as she finished the last stitch on a pair of canvas trousers, she paused and looked at her hands in the flickering lamplight. They were not the hands of the woman who had stepped off the train. They were the hands of a woman who worked, a woman who survived. The shadow she cast on the wall was long and solitary, but it was the shadow of a person standing on her own 2 feet, in a place she was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to make her own. The town of New Canaan had a currency more valuable than the silver dollars that occasionally passed through it. That currency was talk. It was traded over cracker barrels in the general store, whispered behind gloved hands after church, and spoken aloud in the smoky, whiskey-soaked air of the watering hole. And for the past month, the name on every tongue was Clara Mayfield. Inside the saloon, the talk was a man's talk, coarse and unvarnished. It was a place where reputations were made and broken between sips of rye. Jebediah Stone, a rancher whose land was as poor as his disposition, leaned back in his chair, a half-empty glass in his hand. "Still here," he announced to the room at large, a smirk playing on his lips. "That Mayfield woman. Saw her this morning, walking with her chin so high you'd think she was sniffing the clouds, like she didn't get sent packing by the most eligible man in the territory. A chorus of low chuckles answered him. Hank, a freighter whose gut strained the buttons of his vest, wiped foam from his mustache. Benton's a smart man. Knows what he wants. A wife should be a comfort, not a cactus. Can you imagine trying to tell that one what to do? She'd likely correct your grammar. This brought a louder laugh. They pictured her, this strange, self-possessed woman, and compared her to their own wives and the other women they knew. Women like Mary Henderson, the blacksmith's wife, a soft-spoken, doe-eyed creature who was always pregnant and never had an opinion her husband didn't give her first. Women who knew their place was in the home, their purpose to soothe a man's brow and fill his belly. She's taken to mending shirts, I hear. Jeb sneered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Down at Alma's place, mending dirty laundry for 10 cents a tear. That's a long fall from being an attorney's wife. It's unnatural, Hank declared, thumping his glass on the bar for emphasis. A woman can't make her own way. Not a respectable one. Anyhow, she's too stubborn for her own good. A woman without a man to guide her, she'll spoil, like fruit left on the vine. The conversation drifted, as it always did, to speculation. The men, their minds loosened by drink, wondered about her life at Alma's, a place known for housing rough, transient men. Their jokes were crude, their insinuations pointed. In their world, a woman's value was tied directly to a man, a father, a husband. A woman alone was a broken piece, an object of suspicion and scorn, in their eyes. Clara Mayfield was not resilient. She was simply refusing to accept her own defeat. The talk among the women was different. It was quieter, sharper, and wielded with the precision of a stiletto. At Gable's general store, standing between barrels of pickles and bolts of calico, the verdict was delivered in hushed, concerned tones that were more damning than any saloon laughter. "It's the pride," said Mrs. Henderson, the blacksmith's wife, her voice a pious whisper. She was speaking to Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was perpetually pinched in an expression of mild disapproval. "Pride goeth before a fall. The good book tells us so. She carries herself as if she is better than this place, better than us. And living at Alma's." "Mrs." Gable added, lowering her voice conspiratorially as she weighed out a bag of beans. "It's hardly a suitable residence for a lady. All those men, coming and going at all hours. It gives the town a bad name." "Her hands, have you seen them?" Mrs. Henderson continued. "They're becoming rough. It's a tragedy. She came here to be a wife, to run a fine home. Now she spends her days with a needle and thread, mending the clothes of men she isn't even married to." There it was, the heart of their judgment. Clara had stepped outside the neatly defined circle of a woman's life. She was not a wife, not a mother, not a daughter under a father's roof. She was an anomaly, a variable they could not account for. Her competence was not a virtue. It was an affront to the natural order of things. Her refusal to be broken was seen not as strength, but as a stubborn refusal to accept her proper, pitiable place. But the currency of talk, like any currency, could be swayed by the market, and the market was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to shift. The change wasn't happening in the pious conversations of the town's matriarchs, but in the quiet, pragmatic corners of a man's world. It began with the shirts. The cowboys from the Circle C and other outfits who brought their torn garments to Clara left with more than a simple repair. They left with a small miracle of craftsmanship. The seams she sewed were stronger than the original fabric, her patches nearly invisible. She didn't just mend the clothes. She restored them. For men whose lives were hard on their few possessions, this was a service of immense value. Then there were the letters. A young wrangler, barely 18, came to her one evening, hat in his hands, his face flushed with a painful shyness. His mother was sick back in Ohio, and he couldn't write a lick. He stumbled through his feelings, a jumble of love and fear and homesickness. Clara listened patiently. her pen poised over a clean sheet of paper. She didn't just transcribe his words. She found the poetry within them. She translated his raw emotion into sentences of simple, powerful grace. When she read it back to him, his eyes filled with tears. "That's it, ma'am," he whispered, his voice thick. "That's exactly what my heart wanted to say." Word of this new service spread as well. More men came, men who were masters of a rope and a branding iron, but strangers to the written word. They brought her their business troubles, their sweet nothings for girls back home, their difficult, overdue apologies. She became their confessor, their translator, their bridge to a world of sentiment they could feel but not express. The whispers in town began to have a new, competing echo. One afternoon, Clara went to the general store to purchase more thread. The bell above the door announced her arrival, and the usual lull in conversation occurred. Mrs. Gable gave her a curt, cool nod from behind the counter. But as Clara was paying, Mr. Gable, a man who usually ignored her, cleared his throat. "Miss Mayfield," he said, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "That note you wrote for Jedediah Stone, the one to the freight company about his lost shipment." "Yes," Clara said, bracing herself for a complaint. "They answered, found the shipment. It was misdirected to Santa Fe." He paused, looking down at his own messy ledger. "Jedediah said you laid out the facts clearer than any lawyer would have. Saved him $100. It was not a compliment, not exactly. It was a statement of fact, delivered in a grudging tone. But in the quiet of the store, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was an acknowledgement of her skill, her value, a value that had nothing to do with her marital status. Mrs. Gable's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The real shift happened, as most things in New Canaan did. In the saloon. It was a Saturday night, and the place was crowded. Jedediah Stone, emboldened by rye, was on his favorite topic. 10 cents a shirt, he was saying with a loud, braying laugh. "I wonder what other services the high and mighty Miss Mayfield offers for a dime." The insinuation was ugly and clear. A few men laughed with him, but this time, not everyone did. From a corner table, a young man stood up. It was Billy, the raw-boned cowboy whose shirt had been the first she'd ever mended. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady. "You'd best shut your mouth, Jeb," he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the room. Jeb turned, his eyes wide with mock surprise. "Well, look here, the lady's got a champion." "I ain't her champion," Billy said, taking a step forward. "I'm just a man who knows decency when he sees it. That woman took my shirt when it was nothing but rags and made it whole again. And she wrote a letter to my mother for me. A letter that made my ma write back saying she cried for an hour. It was so beautiful. She's treated me and every other hand from the Circle C with more respect than you've shown anyone in your whole miserable life. She's a lady, and you ain't fit to speak her name." A profound silence fell over the saloon. The bartender stopped polishing a glass. The piano player's hands froze above the keys. Jedediah's face turned a mottled red. He was bigger than Billy, and meaner. For a moment, it looked as if violence would erupt. But then Jeb looked around the room. He saw the other cowboys from the Circle C watching him, their expressions hard. He saw other men, men for whom Clara had written letters or mended clothes, looking at him with a flat, cold disapproval. He had misjudged the room. The talk had changed, and he was the last to know. With a curse, Jeb slammed his glass down on the table and shoved his way out the swinging doors into the night. The silence lingered for a moment longer, and then, slowly, the low hum of conversation resumed. But something had been broken, and something new had been forged. The town still whispered, but now there were 2 stories being told. One was a tale of a proud woman's fall. The other was a story of quiet competence, of unexpected decency, of a woman who, when pushed to the edge, had simply dug in her heels and started to build. The whispers of scorn were now met with whispers of respect, and in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of New Canaan, that was a victory more profound than any she could have imagined. It was Jonah Carter who broke the rhythm of her new life. He appeared one evening as dusk was settling, a tall, quiet shadow in the doorway of Alma's common room. The cowboys inside, nursing beers or waiting for supper, fell silent. Jonah's presence had that effect. He was not a man who commanded attention with words, but with a stillness, a centered gravity that drew the eye. He removed his hat, revealing hair bleached by the sun, and nodded once to the room. His gaze found Clara where she sat at her small table, a half-mended shirt in her lap, her brow furrowed in concentration under the lamplight. "Miss Mayfield," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the quiet. Clara looked up, her needle poised mid-stitch. "Mr. Carter." He did not waste time with pleasantries. It was not his way. "I'm told you have a talent for straightening out tangled accounts." "I have some experience," she allowed, her tone neutral. "My book's at the ranch," he said, and for the first time, she detected a note of weariness in his voice, a faint crack in his stoic facade. "They're a mess. My last foreman had a better hand with a rope than a pen. I can't make sense of the tallies. I'm losing cattle, I know it. I just can't prove where or how many." He met her eyes directly, a silent admission of a problem too big to solve alone. "I need someone who can read the story the numbers are telling. I'll pay for your time." The request was a shock. It was one thing to mend shirts and balance the simple books of a boarding house. It was another entirely to be invited into the heart of a man's livelihood. A place as private and guarded as a cattle ranch, it was an expression of trust, a commodity rarer and more valuable than water in this territory. "I don't know anything about ranching," she said honestly. "You don't need to," he replied. "You just need to know numbers. The rest is my problem." He paused. "I can send a buckboard for you in the morning." The next day, Clara found herself sitting on the hard wooden seat of a wagon, her small valise at her feet, heading north out of New Canaan. Jonah drove, his hands light but firm on the reins. They didn't speak much. The landscape itself seemed to forbid idle chatter. It was a vast, unforgiving country, a world of muted colors, the pale gray-green of sagebrush, the dusty brown of the earth, the bleached white of a steer skull lying half-buried in the sand. The sun was a physical weight, and the wind was a constant, restless presence, whipping strands of hair from her carefully pinned chignon and tasting of dust. After 2 hours, the land began to change. Low, rolling hills appeared, covered in the sparse, straw-colored grass that was the lifeblood of this country. And then she saw it. The Circle C. It was not a picturesque farm. It was a testament to function over form. A long, low ranch house, built of timber and adobe, hunkered down as if bracing itself against the wind. Nearby stood a bunkhouse for the hands, a blacksmith shed, and a sprawling network of corrals, their fences looking like intricate skeletons against the pale sky. The entire place looked thirsty, scoured by wind and baked by the sun. It was a lonely outpost of human endeavor in a vast, indifferent wilderness. As they pulled into the yard, a handful of men stopped their work to watch. They were lean, hard men. Their faces burned to the color of old leather. Their stares were not overtly hostile, but they were wary, suspicious. She was an alien creature here, a woman in a world of men, a symbol of the town and its soft ways in a place defined by grit and hardship. Jonah helped her down, his hand briefly touching her elbow, a fleeting, impersonal contact that was nonetheless startling in its firm reality. "The house," he said, gesturing with his chin. "You'll have a room. It's simple." The inside of the ranch house was as stark as the outside. The main room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace and a long table scarred with the marks of countless meals. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. It was a man's space, clean but unadorned, stripped of anything that did not serve a purpose. Jonah led her to a small corner of the room where a battered desk was piled high with dusty, curl-edged ledgers. "This is it," he said. "The whole damn mess." For the next week, that desk became Clara's world. She worked by the light of a window during the day and by the flickering glow of a kerosene lamp long after the rest of the ranch had fallen into an exhausted sleep. The books were, as Jonah had said, a disaster. They were a chaotic tangle of mismatched tallies, unpaid wages, and receipts for feed and supplies written on scraps of paper and stuffed between the pages. But as she worked, a grim story began to emerge from the chaos. Jonah was right. He was losing cattle. A tally from the spring branding would show 200 new calves, but the count for the fall sale would only account for 150, 30, 40. 50 head of cattle were simply vanishing between seasons. They were small losses, a few at a time, but they were adding up, bleeding the ranch dry like 1,000 tiny cuts. She saw the signs of the drought in the receipts for hay and corn, purchased at exorbitant prices from freighters. She saw the strain it put on the men in the wage accounts. Payments were late, sometimes by weeks. A kind of simmering discontent was written in the numbers, a ledger of frustration and low morale. Her days took on a new, strange rhythm. She would wake before dawn to the sounds of the ranch stirring to life, the clatter of the cook in the kitchen, the low calls of the men in the bunkhouse, the soft nickering of horses. She would eat breakfast with Jonah at the big table, a silent meal where the only communication was the passing of the salt or the coffee pot. Then she would work, the scratch of her pen a quiet, constant sound in the house while the life of the ranch unfolded outside her window. She saw the grueling reality of the life these men lived. She saw them ride out at dawn, their faces set and determined, and return at dusk, slumped in their saddles, their bodies caked in a uniform layer of dust and sweat. She saw the injuries, a rope-burned hand, a leg crushed by a spooked horse, and the quiet, stoic way they were endured. There was no room for complaint in this world. There was only the work, endless and demanding. And she saw Jonah. She saw him not just as the quiet cowboy who had helped her, but as the master of this failing kingdom. He was the first one up and the last one to bed. He worked alongside his men, his hands as calloused as theirs, his face as deeply lined with worry. She saw him standing by the corral, his shoulders slumped in exhaustion, staring out at the parched hills as if he could will rain to fall from the brassy sky. He carried the weight of it, all the missing cattle, the dry creeks, the payroll he struggled to meet, and he carried it alone. Their conversations were brief, stripped to the bone of necessity. "This entry," she would say, pointing a slender finger at a smudged number. "It says you bought 50 bags of feed in July. The receipt from the freighter says 40. He would lean over her shoulder, his presence a warm, solid weight in the cool room. She could smell the scent of horse and sun and clean sweat on his clothes. "That freighter's a thief," he would say, his voice a low growl. "Make a note of it." Another time, she found a discrepancy in the wages. "You've been paying Billy $10 a month less than the other hands." Jonah sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. His father was a friend, died a few years back. The boy sends most of his pay to his mother. I send the other 10 directly to her myself. Billy doesn't know. He's too proud. Slowly, piece by piece, she was learning the story not just of the ranch, but of the man. She saw his quiet integrity, his fierce loyalty, his silent struggle against a world that seemed determined to crush him. One night, she worked later than usual, trying to reconcile a final set of numbers. The house was utterly silent. The fire in the hearth burned down to glowing embers. She heard the soft tread of his boots on the floorboards and looked up to see him standing there, a tin mug of coffee in each hand. He placed one on the desk beside her without a word and sat in a chair across from her, cradling his own mug in his hands. They sat in a comfortable silence, The only sound the soft hiss of the lamp and the distant cry of a coyote. "You found it, then," he said at last. Not a question, but a statement. "You're being robbed," she said quietly. "A few head at a time. It's being done by someone who knows your land, knows your count is in chaos. They take just enough that you might mistake it for losses to wolves or bad water." He nodded, his jaw tight. "I knew it. I just couldn't see it plain." He looked at her, his clear gray eyes reflecting the lamplight. "You see things plain, Miss Mayfield." "The numbers don't lie," she said. "And your payroll is 2 months behind for 3 of your best men. They're good men, Mr. Carter, but loyalty doesn't fill a man's pockets." He stared into his coffee cup. "There's no money. The drought's taken everything. I sell off more beef to buy feed for the rest. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it." "Then you need to make the bucket smaller," she said, her voice firm. "We need to organize this. We need to create a system for tracking the brand tallies, for logging supplies, for regularizing the pay. You're trying to fight a war on 3 fronts against thieves, against the weather, and against this." She tapped the messy ledger. "And this is the one you can win." He looked at her, a long, searching look. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of something new, not just respect for her skill, but a kind of weary gratitude. He was a man accustomed to standing alone, and for the first time, someone was standing with him, not to offer comfort, but to offer a weapon. From that night on, something shifted. She was no longer just a hired accountant. She was a partner in his struggle. She devised a new system of ledgers, clear and logical. She organized the payroll, creating a plan to pay back the wages owed. She became the still, quiet center of the ranch's chaotic business, a bastion of order against the encroaching darkness. The men's attitude toward her changed. Their wariness was replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. They saw her lamp burning late into the night. They saw the worry ease, just slightly, from their boss's face. She was no longer the strange woman from the east. She was Miss Mayfield, the one who was helping the boss save the Circle C. She was, in her own strange, unexpected way, becoming one of them. A buckboard wagon is a fragile vessel on the vast, unforgiving ocean of the plains, and the weekly trip into New Canaan for supplies felt like a journey to a foreign shore. For Clara, the ranch had become her world. Its rhythms were dictated by the sun and the needs of the herd. Its problems were tangible, the price of feed. The level of the creek, the integrity of a fence line. The town, by contrast, was a place of intangible threats, of whispers that could cut deeper than a branding iron. As she and Jonah rode, the silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with a shared understanding. He would point to a distant butte, its top flattened by an eternity of wind, and tell her its name. She would read him the list of supplies, her clear voice a counterpoint to the creak of the wagon wheels, and he would nod, calculating costs in his head. They had become a partnership, forged in the quiet desperation of the ranch house, their roles as clearly defined as the columns in the new ledgers she had created. But as the false-fronted buildings of New Canaan rose from the heat haze, the easy quiet between them evaporated, replaced by a familiar tension. The town was watching. It always was. The whispers had had weeks to fester and grow, mutating from grudging respect into something far more venomous. The story of Clara Mayfield had taken a new, scandalous turn. It was no longer a tale of a jilted woman's resilience. It was now a cautionary tale of a woman's fall from grace. "Living out there, Mrs." Gable would say over the counter of the general store, her voice thick with disapproval. "Unmarried, the only woman for 10 miles, surrounded by those men. It's an affront to decency." "She's not just mending his shirts anymore," Mrs. Henderson would add, her eyes wide with feigned horror. "They say she runs his books, tells him when to buy and when to sell. She has inserted herself into a man's business. It's unnatural." The gossip in the watering hole was cruder, stripped of the pretense of moral concern. Carter was always a loner, Hank the freighter opined. his audience of drinkers hanging on his words. Guess he finally got tired of his own company, found himself a bookkeeper who offers other services. She was meant for a lawyer, and now she's bedding down with a cowboy. Another man slurred, to a round of coarse laughter. Some women ain't particular where they land, long as there's a man to land on. They twisted her competence into a weapon against her. Her intelligence was cunning. Her resilience was shamelessness. In their small, rigidly defined world, a woman who survived without a husband must be surviving by unholy means. The woman who had been pitied was now condemned. When Jonah pulled the buckboard to a stop in front of Gable's, Clara could feel the change. The stares were no longer just curious. They were prurient, hungry for a glimpse of the fallen woman. She kept her head high as Jonah helped her down, her back a rigid line of defiance, but inside, the familiar cold knot of anxiety tightened. The town's judgment was a poison, and she feared there was no antidote. They were loading the last of the sacks of flour and beans into the back of the wagon when a familiar voice cut through the street noise. "Miss Mayfield, a word, if I may." Clara froze. She turned slowly. Charles Benton stood on the boardwalk not 10 feet away. He was dressed, as always, in his immaculate suit and starched collar, a dark, sober figure against the town's dusty backdrop. He looked at her, and his gaze was one of profound disappointment, as if she were a prized possession that had become irrevocably tarnished. His eyes flickered for a moment to Jonah, who stood silently by the wagon, his face unreadable, before dismissing him as one might dismiss a piece of livestock. "Mr. Benton," Clara said, her voice cool and even. He stepped closer, his expression a mask of paternalistic concern. The people on the street, sensing a confrontation, began to slow their steps. A curtain twitched in the window of the dress shop across the way. An audience was gathering. "I have been hearing the most distressing rumors," Benton began, his voice low and sonorous, intended for her ears but loud enough for others to catch. "Your continued presence at the Circle C, it has become a subject of considerable speculation. What people choose to speculate upon is no concern of mine," Clara replied, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "But it should be," he insisted, taking another step. He was close enough now that she could smell the faint scent of bay rum and self-satisfaction. "A woman's reputation is her most valuable asset. It is a delicate flower, easily bruised. You cannot simply live as you please, out in that wild place, and expect society to turn a blind eye." He gestured vaguely toward the ranch, a gesture of dismissal that encompassed Jonah, the hard-working men, and the life she was painstakingly building. "Your Honor, Miss Mayfield is not a thing to be paraded about in the dust of a cattle yard. It is a private virtue, best kept sheltered, behind drawn curtains and a locked door." The insult was breathtaking in its arrogance. He was lecturing her on honor, the man who had dismissed her like a piece of faulty merchandise because he feared the town's gossip. He, who had left her stranded and penniless without a backward glance. The injustice of it was a hot, molten thing that burned away the last of her fear, leaving behind only a cold, hard anger. The street had gone quiet. Everyone was watching, waiting for her response. They expected tears, a stammered defense, a woman's hysterical denial. They expected her to crumble. Clara took a slow, deliberate breath. She looked not at Benton's condescending face, but into his eyes, and she let him see the woman she had become. She was not the pale, exhausted creature who had sat in his office. This woman had faced down desperation and found it wanting. This woman had learned the brutal arithmetic of survival. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was clear and sharp as shattered glass. It carried across the silent street. "My honor, Mr. Benton," she said, a dangerous quiet in her tone. "You dare to speak to me of honor." Benton's smug expression faltered. He had not expected this. You speak of curtains and locked doors, she continued, her gaze unwavering. But honor is not a piece of furniture to be hidden away. It is tested in the open, under the sun. It is measured by courage. And your courage, sir, was found wanting the moment you valued the whispers of this town more than the promises you made in your letters. A collective gasp went through the small crowd of onlookers. This was no longer a private rebuke. It was a public indictment. I came to this town to stand beside you, Clara said, her voice rising with a controlled passion. And you did not have the strength to stand beside me. You left me on a train platform with nothing but my pride, at the mercy of the very tongues you now claim to be so concerned with. She took a step toward him, and it was he who instinctively recoiled. So let me be perfectly clear, she finished, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that was more powerful than any shout. If you did not have the courage to stand with me then, Mr. Benton, you most certainly do not have the right to speak of my honor now. The silence that followed was absolute, a ringing void in which Benton's public humiliation was complete. His face, which had been flushed with righteous authority, was now a pale, mottled mask of shock and fury. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He had been so utterly and completely dismantled, his hypocrisy laid bare for the entire town to see. He had come to put her in her place, and she had shown him his, without another glance at him. Clara turned her back. She walked to the buckboard, her movements calm and deliberate. Jonah, who had remained as still as a statue throughout the entire exchange, simply held out a hand to help her up onto the seat. His face was impassive, but as her eyes met his, she saw a flicker of something in their gray depths, a profound, almost fierce, respect. She sat, her hands folded in her lap, and stared straight ahead as Jonah picked up the reins and clicked to the horses. The wagon lurched forward, pulling away from the silent, staring crowd and the frozen figure of Charles Benton, as they left the town behind, heading back toward the harsh, honest emptiness of the plains. Clara did not look back. She had drawn her own line in the dust of New Canaan, and she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that nothing would ever be the same. The ride back from town was always a slow unwinding of a tightly coiled spring. The tension of the staring eyes and whispered judgments would gradually recede with each turn of the wagon wheels, replaced by the vast, honest silence of the plains. But on this day, the spring refused to unwind. The memory of Charles Benton's face, pale with impotent rage, and the collective, silent judgment of the crowd was a fresh and bleeding wound. Clara sat straight-backed on the buckboard seat, her gaze fixed on the horizon, but her mind was replaying the scene with a torturous clarity. Jonah, for his part, was silent. He drove the team with a steady hand, his eyes scanning the landscape with the habitual vigilance of a man who lived in a constant, low-grade state of war with his surroundings. He hadn't said a word about the confrontation. He didn't need to. In the brief, intense glance they had shared as they left town, an entire conversation had passed between them. He had seen her fight, and he had understood. They were perhaps a mile from the Circle's sea, the low-slung buildings a dark line on the horizon. When Jonah suddenly pulled the team to a halt, the abruptness of the motion startled Clara from her reverie. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. He was looking north, his gray eyes narrowed to slits, his head cocked as if listening to a sound she couldn't hear. "Dust," he said, his voice a low growl. "Too much of it, and coming fast." Clara followed his gaze. She could see it now, a faint, rising plume of brown against the pale blue sky, far to the north where the ranch's main herd grazed in the summer pastures. It wasn't the lazy drift of a herd being moved slowly. It was the agitated cloud of a stampede, or a herd being driven hard and fast. Without a word, Jonah wrapped the reins around the brake handle, stood up in the wagon for a better view, and unslung a long spyglass from a leather case. He put it to his eye, his body perfectly still. The silence stretched, thick with a sudden, unspoken dread. The wind whistled past Clara's ears. "Damn it!" he breathed, the words a harsh exhalation of air. He lowered the glass, his face set like granite. "Rustlers, a half-dozen of them. They're pushing about 50 head south, toward the Badlands." He looked at her, his eyes cold with a fury she had never seen before. "It's Slade. I recognize the big pinto he rides." The name meant nothing to Clara, but the grim finality in his tone told her everything she needed to know. "What will you do?" she asked, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Get back to the ranch. Get the men." He was already calculating, his mind working with a cold, swift precision. "They've got a 2-hour start. They'll be at Haskell's Pass by the time we can get mounted and ride." He looked from the dust cloud back toward New Canaan, then at Clara. A decision was made. "I'm taking the wagon back to town," he said, his voice clipped and hard. "It's faster. I can cut them off before the pass if I ride hard. You stay here. Get low if you see anyone. I'll send one of the boys back for you." His plan made a brutal kind of sense, but it left her stranded, a helpless spectator. The thought was intolerable. "No," she said, the word coming out with a surprising force. "Take me with you. You'll need someone to watch the team. It will be faster than you coming back for them." He looked at her, ready to refuse, to argue that it was too dangerous. But he saw the look in her eyes. It was not the plea of a frightened woman, but the steady resolve of a partner. He saw the same steel she had shown Charles Benton. He gave a single, sharp nod. The ride back to New Canaan was a wild, desperate race against time. Jonah pushed the team of horses harder than Clara had ever seen, his voice a low, urgent murmur, his hands firm on the reins. The buckboard bounced and rattled over the rough track, threatening to shake itself to pieces. Clara held on to the seat, her knuckles white, her body jolted with every rut and rock. The town grew closer, no longer a haven of judgment but a strategic objective. As they neared the outskirts, Jonah pulled a heavy Colt revolver from beneath the seat and checked its load. The metallic click of the hammer was the loudest sound in the world. "When we get to the livery, you get down and stay down," he commanded. "Don't move from the stable. You understand?" She understood his order, but in her heart, she knew she would not obey it. They thundered down the main street, a whirlwind of dust and rattling wood. People scattered, their faces a mixture of alarm and annoyance. Jonah reined the lathered, heaving horses to a stop in front of the livery stable, leaping down before the wagon had fully stopped. "Billy Silas!" he roared, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. "Slade's run off 50 head they're making for Haskell's Pass. Get your rifles and horses." Men spilled out of the saloon and the general store, their faces slack with surprise. Billy and Silas, who had been in town for supplies, came running from the livery, their expressions instantly hardening. The quiet afternoon had just exploded. Clara watched as Jonah, Billy, and 2 other Circle C men who had been in town swarmed into action. Saddles were thrown onto the backs of fresh horses. Rifle scabbards were buckled tight. There was no wasted motion, only a grim, practiced efficiency that spoke of a life where violence was a constant possibility. At the other end of the street, a group of 5 riders appeared, driving a small, frantic bunch of cattle before them. It was Slade and his men. They had not expected Jonah to be in town. Their plan had been to push the stolen herd through the deserted southern edge and be gone. Now, they were trapped. The leader, a big man on a pinto horse with a cruel, scarred face, saw Jonah and his men mounting up. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. He and his men reined in, their hands hovering near the guns on their hips. The town held its breath. The street, which moments before had been a place of commerce and conversation, became a silent, sun-baked stage. Doors slammed shut, windows were shuttered. The townsfolk, who had been so quick to judge Clara from a position of safety, vanished like smoke, their courage dissolving in the face of real danger. The only sound was the nervous shuffling of the horses and the low, frightened bawling of the stolen cattle. Clara stood by the buckboard, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Jonah's order to stay put rang in her ears, but her feet were rooted to the spot. To hide now felt like a betrayal. It felt like the kind of cowardice she had so recently condemned in Charles Benton. Slowly, she walked away from the relative cover of the livery. She crossed the empty street, her steps deliberate, her gaze locked on the unfolding drama. She stopped on the covered boardwalk in front of Gable's General Store, the place where she had been so mercilessly judged. She stood by one of the wooden support posts, her hands gripping it for support, and she watched. From her vantage point, she could see it all. Jonah and his 4 men spread out in a loose line, their faces grim, their rifles held ready, Slade and his rustlers, confident in their numbers. Their expressions a mixture of arrogance and predatory hunger, and in the windows and doorways, she could see the furtive, frightened faces of the people of New Canaan, peering out at the conflict they had no wish to be a part of. "That's my cattle, Slade." Jonah's voice cut through the tension, hard and clear. "Turn 'em back." Slade laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're a little outnumbered. Carter, I count 5 of you and 5 of us, but we're the ones with the herd. Just ride away, and we'll let you live." "The only place you're riding," Jonah said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet, "is to hell." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She saw Slade's hand drop. The world erupted in a deafening cacophony of noise. The first shot was a sharp crack, followed instantly by a rolling thunder of gunfire that echoed off the false-fronted buildings. Acrid black powder smoke filled the air, thick and choking. A horse screamed and went down. Men were yelling, their voices lost in the roar of the guns. It was not a noble duel. It was a chaotic, brutal, and terrifyingly fast explosion of violence. Dust kicked up from the street, mingling with the smoke, obscuring the scene in a hazy, surreal fog. Clara could see flashes of orange fire from the muzzles of the guns. She saw one of the rustlers clutch his chest and slide slowly from his saddle. She saw Billy, crouched behind a water trough, firing his rifle with a steady, methodical calm. Her eyes searched desperately for Jonah. She saw him near the center of the street, using his horse for cover. He was firing his revolver, his movements economical and precise. He was a figure of absolute, focused lethality. As she watched, a bullet tore through the sleeve of his shirt, and he flinched. A brief, sharp motion. Her heart stopped. He was hit, but he didn't go down. He shifted his position, his face a mask of cold fury, and returned fire. Another rustler went down, his horse bolting in terror. The fight was over in less than a minute. Seeing 2 of their men on the ground, the remaining 3 rustlers, including Slade, broke. They wheeled their horses around and galloped frantically out of town, leaving the stolen cattle behind. Silence descended. As sudden and absolute as the noise had been, it was a ringing, deafening silence, broken only by the whimpering of a wounded man and the nervous panting of the horses. Slowly, tentatively, the people of New Canaan emerged from their hiding places. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. They looked at the bodies in the street, at the weary, smoke-stained faces of the Circle C men. And then they looked at Clara. She was still standing on the porch of the general store, her knuckles white where she gripped the post. Her bonnet had been knocked askew, and a smudge of dirt was on her cheek. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with the horror of what she had witnessed. But she had not screamed, she had not fainted, she had not hidden. She had stood her ground, a silent, unflinching witness. She had borne witness not just to the fight, but to the courage of the man she had chosen to stand with. Her gaze was fixed on Jonah. He was walking toward her, his revolver still smoking in his hand. His left arm hung awkwardly at his side, and blood was soaking through the torn fabric of his sleeve. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and in that moment, the town and its whispers ceased to exist. The confrontation with Benton had been a victory of words. This was something different. This was a victory of the spirit, a public testament to a quiet, unyielding courage that the town had never suspected she possessed. Her honor, which they had so eagerly debated and condemned, had just been defined, not in a parlor or behind a curtain, but in the harsh, violent light of a sun-drenched street, amidst the smell of gunpowder and the taste of fear. The roar of the guns faded, but the silence that replaced it was not one of peace. It was a heavy, ringing void, filled with the ghosts of what had just happened. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air like a foul mist, a stark reminder of how close death had brushed against the town's main street. In the aftermath, a strange, dreamlike clarity descended. Clara moved without thinking, her hands acting with a purpose her stunned mind had not yet caught up to. She was at Jonah's side, her fingers tearing a strip of clean cloth from her petticoat as the town doctor, a portly, sweating man named Miller, bustled over. "It's a graze," Jonah said, his voice tight with pain, waving off the doctor's fussing hands. "Just a damn graze." But Clara ignored his protests. She saw the blood, dark and shockingly real, soaking his sleeve. With a steady hand, she tied the strip of cloth above the wound, her movements swift and sure. The townspeople, emerging slowly from their hiding places, watched this small, intimate act with a kind of mesmerized awe. They saw not a hysterical woman, but a figure of calm competence, her face pale but her hands unwavering. She was tending to her own. In the days that followed, the town of New Canaan struggled to reconcile the two Clara Mayfields it now held in its collective mind. The gunfight had fractured public opinion, shattering the simple narrative of the jilted mail-order bride. The whispers did not cease. They simply split into two competing, dissonant choruses. The first was a chorus of grudging, and in some cases, open admiration. The men of the Circle C now looked at her with an almost reverential respect. When she was in the general store, Billy or Silas would tip their hats and ask, "Everything all right?" Ma'am, their voices imbued with a protective sincerity. Even Mr. Gable, the storekeeper, now met her eye directly, a new awareness in his gaze. He had seen her stand her ground on his own porch while he had been crouched behind his pickle barrel. He had seen her courage, and it had, however reluctantly, earned his respect. These were the people who understood the brutal calculus of the West's survival was the only true virtue, and courage was its primary currency. Clara had proven she had both in spades. But the second chorus was just as loud, and far more insidious. It came from the parlors and sewing circles, from the pews on Sunday morning, and from the bitter, humiliated heart of Charles Benton. To these people, Clara's actions had not been courageous. They had been brazen. To stand and watch such a thing, a display of masculine violence. "Mrs." Gable pronounced to her circle of friends, her voice dripping with sanctimonious horror. It was unseemly. A true lady would have swooned, or at the very least, had the decency to hide her eyes. "She has no sense of propriety," agreed Mrs. Henderson. "She has been coarsened by that ranch, by the company she keeps. She acts more like a man than a woman." For them, Clara's strength was a terrifying anomaly. It was a rejection of the delicate, sheltered femininity they had built their lives and identities upon. If a woman could stand alone, unflinching in the face of chaos, then what was the value of their own carefully cultivated helplessness? Her independence was a threat, her courage an indictment of their own protected lives. Charles Benton, for his part, said little. But his silence was a simmering cauldron of resentment. He had been publicly shamed by the very woman he had deemed unfit, and his wounded pride sought any reason to condemn her. Her bravery was, to him, the final, unforgivable proof of her unsuitability as a proper, docile wife. Clara felt the division in every glance, every conversation. The town had become a dizzying landscape of competing judgments. The same act that earned her a respectful nod from a cowboy would earn her a cold shoulder from his wife. She was simultaneously a hero and a pariah, a figure of admiration and an object of scorn. The weight of it was exhausting. One evening, back in the quiet sanctuary of Alma's kitchen, the weight became too much. She sat at the long trestle table, staring into a cup of cooling tea, the day's mending lying untouched in a basket beside her. The noise of the town was a constant hum in her mind. Alma, who had been watching her with her sharp, knowing eyes, sat down opposite her. She pushed a plate of freshly baked bread across the table. "You're letting them get to you," Alma said. It wasn't a question. "They don't stop," Clara whispered, her voice weary. "The talk, no matter what I do, it doesn't stop. I thought, after the gunfight, I thought they would see..." "See what?" Alma interrupted, her voice not unkind, but firm as bedrock. "That you're not the woman they thought you were, honey. They see exactly what they want to see. The men who value grit, they see grit. The women who value fainting spells, they see a woman who forgot to faint. You can't change the lens they look through." She leaned forward, her strong, work-worn hands flat on the table. "Their talk will never stop. Not as long as you're here, drawing breath and defying their expectations. When they run out of things to say about the gunfight, they'll find something else. The way you wear your hair, the price you charge for a patch. It's the wind. Child, it's just the wind, and it never stops blowing in this country." Clara looked down at her hands. The calluses were thicker now, the skin no longer soft. They were the hands of a stranger. "Then what is the point?" she asked, a profound weariness in her soul. "Perhaps I should just leave. Go back east. I could..." "You could," Alma agreed. "You could get on that Tuesday train and be gone. And they'd talk about that, too. They'd say they were right all along, that you couldn't handle it, that you finally broke and ran. They'd say you came to your senses and went back where you belonged." Alma's gaze was intense. "Their talk is going to tell a story about you no matter what you do. The only choice you've got is what story you want to live." She stood up. Her point made. "Their talk will never stop," she repeated, her voice softer now. "But whether you stand tall and let it blow past you, or whether you bow your head and let it bury you in the dust, that choice is yours, and yours alone." Alma's words lingered in the quiet kitchen long after she had gone. The choice is yours. Clara spent that night in her small room, not sleeping, but thinking. For the first time, she truly considered leaving. The idea was a seductive comfort, to return to a world of predictable seasons, of paved streets, of conversations that did not feel like trials, to leave behind the judgment, the dust, the constant, grinding struggle. She had enough money now. She could go. But as she stared out the window at the vast, star-dusted darkness of the plains, she knew she couldn't. To leave now would be to let them win. It would be an admission that she was, in fact, the woman they thought she was, an outsider, a temporary disruption who ultimately could not endure. It would mean that her pride, the iron core of her being that had sustained her through every humiliation, was a hollow thing after all. Leaving was surrender, and she was not ready to surrender. A new idea began to form in her mind, a quiet, radical, and terrifying thought. She would not just stay, she would put down roots. She would not just work from the corner of Alma's common room, an object of charity and curiosity. She would build something of her own. There was a small, derelict building on the east side of the main square. It had once been an assay office, abandoned after the last minor gold rush had fizzled out. It was little more than a dusty shack, with a grimy window and a door that hung crookedly on its hinges. But it was in the center of town. It was visible. It was a direct, public challenge. The next morning, Clara did not sit down at her mending table. She put on her sturdiest dress, pinned her bonnet firmly in place, and walked to the office of the town's land agent. An hour later, she walked out with a lease agreement for the old assay office. paid for with 3 months of her hard-won savings. The town watched, baffled. As she began to work, she did not hire a man to help her. She swept out the years of accumulated dust and grime herself. She washed the window until it gleamed. She bought a can of paint from Mr. Gable, who sold it to her with a look of stunned disbelief, and painted the front of the small building a clean, hopeful white. She paid the blacksmith $1 to straighten the door hinges. Every day, she worked in the open, under the full, curious and judgmental gaze of New Canaan. She was aware of the new whispers this activity generated. What does she think she's doing? That place is falling down. She's making a fool of herself. She ignored them. She let the wind blow past. On the 3rd day, she bought a long, smooth plank of pine and a small can of black paint. That evening, by the light of a lamp in Alma's kitchen, she carefully, meticulously, painted a sign. Her father had taught her calligraphy, and the letters she formed were elegant, proud, and perfectly clear. The next morning, she nailed the sign above the door of the clean, white building. It read, "C. Mayfield seamstress and scribe." She stepped back to look at her work. The sign was a declaration. It was an anchor. It was a statement of fact in a town built on rumor and speculation. She was not the jilted bride. She was not the cowboy's woman. She was not the fallen lady. She was C. Mayfield, seamstress and scribe. She unlocked the door, stepped inside her own small space, and turned to face the town. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the square where she had been shamed, and where she had been vindicated. The whispers had not stopped, and she knew they never would. But as she stood in the doorway of her own shop, built with her own hands and her own courage, she felt their power over her finally, blessedly, begin to fade. She had chosen to stand tall. The small building that housed C. Mayfield, seamstress and scribe, was an island of light in the dark, sleeping square of New Canaan. By day, it was a place of business, a testament to Clara's resilience, where the snip of her scissors and the scratch of her pen were sounds of commerce and survival. But by night, it became something else entirely. It became a home. An oil lamp sat on the small, sturdy table she used for her work, casting a warm, golden circle that pushed back against the immense darkness of the plains outside. The light gleamed on the clean-swept floorboards and the neat bolts of cloth stacked on a shelf. It softened the hard edges of the room, turning a place of labor into a sanctuary of peace. In this small bubble of light, Clara and Jonah Carter sat, the silence between them as comfortable and familiar as the worn denim of the shirt she was mending. It was his shirt, the one that had been torn in the gunfight. The bullet had ripped through the fabric of the sleeve, and while the wound on his arm was now a healing, angry red line, the shirt had remained a casualty of the conflict. She had washed it herself, scrubbing away the grime and the blood, and was now closing the tear with her impossibly neat stitches. Jonah sat in the only other chair the room possessed, a solid oak thing he had built for her himself. He was a large man, and the small room should have felt crowded with him in it, but it didn't. His quiet, steady presence seemed to anchor the space, to make it feel safer, more complete. He was watching her hands, the way the needle and thimble moved with such practiced, efficient grace. He had seen those same hands tie a tourniquet on his bleeding arm with a steadiness that had shamed the town doctor. He had seen them bring order to the chaos of his ledgers. To see them now, performing this simple, domestic act for him, stirred something deep within his guarded heart. The past few weeks had settled into a new, unspoken rhythm. Twice a week, he would ride into town, ostensibly for supplies or to check the telegraph. But his last stop was always here. Sometimes he brought her a piece of quartz he'd found, or a wildflower that had somehow managed to bloom in the parched soil. He never said much. He would just sit, as he was now, and watch her work, sharing a pot of coffee she'd brewed on the small stove in the back. The town, of course, watched him come and go, and the town talked. Clara finished the seam, knotted the thread, and bit it off with a sharp click of her teeth. The repair was a fine, strong line, a neat scar on the blue fabric. She held it up to the light, inspecting her work. "It will hold," she said, her voice soft in the quiet room. "I know," he answered. She folded the shirt and placed it on the table. The work was done. There was nothing left but the silence and the soft hiss of the lamp. She looked up and met his gaze. His clear gray eyes were watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. In his look, she saw none of the town's judgment, none of its suspicion. She saw only a simple, profound acceptance. He saw her, Clara Mayfield, not as the woman who had been jilted or the woman who had stood bravely in a gunfight, but simply as the woman who was here, with him, in this circle of light. Her gaze drifted past him, to the large window that faced the square. She had insisted on keeping it uncovered during the day. She wanted the town to see her working, to see her succeeding on her own terms. But at night, the window was a great, black eye, reflecting the lamplit room and the two of them within it. Anyone walking past could see them, together, alone. She knew what they would be saying. The whispers were as predictable as the setting of the sun. "He spends his nights there now. She's finally trapped a man. Her shop is just a front." The old fear, the familiar sting of their judgment, pricked at her. It was no longer a crippling weight, but it was a ghost that still lingered at the edges of her hard-won peace. She had built this life for herself, this small measure of independence, and now, this new fragile happiness with Jonah was putting it at risk all over again, exposing her to a fresh wave of vicious speculation. She looked at him, at his strong, quiet face, and she knew the price of this happiness was to once again become the town's favorite topic of conversation. She let out a small, quiet sigh, the sound barely disturbing the air. "The town will talk," she said. It was not a question. It was not a complaint. It was a simple statement of fact, the final, weary acknowledgement of an immutable truth. Jonah did not look away. He had seen her face down Charles Benton with words of fire. He had seen her stand unflinching as bullets flew. He saw her now, poised between her fierce pride and her desire for this quiet peace with him. He understood, with a clarity that cut through all the noise of the world, what she was truly saying. She was asking if he was strong enough to stand with her in the storm of their whispers. He shifted in his chair, the simple movement drawing her complete attention. A slow, easy smile touched the corners of his mouth, a rare sight that softened the hard lines of his face. His answer was the foundation of his entire being, the simple, unshakable creed of a man who had long ago made his peace with a harsh world. "Let them," he said. 2 words. That was all. 2 words, spoken in his low, quiet rumble. But they were the strongest words she had ever heard. They were not a dismissal of her fear, but an acceptance of it, and a promise to stand as a shield against it. In those 2 words, he was telling her that the town, with its petty rules and its poisoned tongues, had no power over him, and therefore, it should have no power over them. It was the sound of a door closing on the world and its judgment. It was the sound of a final, unconditional surrender to the truth that was growing between them. A profound, luminous peace washed over Clara, so powerful it felt like the breaking of a fever. The ghost of her fear dissolved, not in the face of defiance, but in the warmth of his simple, unwavering loyalty. A genuine smile, the first truly untroubled smile she had felt in months, spread across her face, reaching her eyes and making them shine in the lamplight. She rose from her chair. He watched her as she walked to the window. For a moment, she stood there, looking at their reflection superimposed over the dark and empty square outside. She saw a man and a woman, bathed in the warm light of a home they were creating together. Then, she reached for the new curtains she had sewn just last week. They were made of a simple, sturdy cotton, the color of a summer sky just before dawn. Her hands, No longer the soft, pale hands of a Boston lady, but the strong, capable hands of a survivor took hold of the fabric with a soft whisper of cloth on wood. She drew the curtains closed, shutting out the darkness, shutting out the whispers, shutting out the entire world. In the soft, enclosed light of the small room, she turned back to him. The town was still out there, and it would talk. But in here, in this small space they had claimed for themselves, they were finally, completely, blessedly free. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with our community. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help us share these stories with even more listeners.